Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Matt Parker for this one. I mean, I can only take that octopus shirt as a not so subtle call out to my channel, so he must be a viewer, right?
Now, I don't play Magic.
Hey, that doesn't prove anything. Well, anyway, he published a video last week where he talked about a not quite infinite combo with some very interesting implications. And many people asked for my take on it, so here it is. First, let's go through the actual combo in question. We'll say that you have this card here, Parallel Lives, which says that if an effect would create any tokens under your control, it creates twice that many tokens instead. And also this card, Miirym, the Sentinel Worm. This one says whenever another non-token dragon enters under your control, you get a token that's a copy of that card. So if you have these two out and you play an Astral Dragon, what happens? Well, there are two triggered abilities that trigger when Astral Dragon enters. It's legal for their controller to stack them in either order, but we'll say the Astral Dragon trigger resolves first because that's what happened in the original video. When this resolves, we'll get two token copies of Parallel Lives, except that the Parallel Lives that we started out with will apply to that and double to 4 tokens. And at this point, the Miirym trigger will resolve, creating a token copy of Astral Dragon. Except, once again, the Parallel Lives will increase that to 2 token Astral Dragons. Except, actually, we don't just have 1 Parallel Lives anymore, we have 5 now. Each of these has a replacement effect that will apply and double the number of Astral Dragons being produced. Doubling something 5 times is equivalent to multiplying by 32, so 32 Astral Dragon tokens will be created. Now there are 32 Astral Dragon ETB triggers on the stack. The first one will create 2 Parallel Lives tokens, except that the 5 existing Parallel Lives will multiply that by 32 for a total of 64 additional Parallel Lives being created. The second will create 2 more Parallel Lives, except this time there are a very nice number of Parallel Lives effects doubling that figure. And we've got 30 more triggers left to go after that, with the number of Parallel Lives jumping higher and higher and higher for each one. How many Parallel Lives do you end up with in total? Well, as far as the actual mathematics involved, I think Matt did a pretty good job going over the results, so I'll refer you to his video if you're interested in a proper explanation. As a bit of a spoiler though, the decimal representation of the number of Parallel Lives would have more digits than the number of atoms in the universe, so there's no way that you could write it down or even calculate what it would be. The remainder of my video will therefore go over some of the consequences from a Magic Tournament official's perspective, which, no offense to Matt, but I think his explanation on that part reminded me a little bit of a Parker square. First off, right out of the gate, his claim that this was the biggest number that's ever actually been used by humans in this game is total bunk. In fact, in almost the same breath, he concedes that the Parker number is much less than Graham's number, which, if you're not a math person, the important thing for you to know is that this is another very large but finite number. Graham's number routinely shows up in real-life Magic games because, as Matt pointed out in his video, Magic only uses integers. If you have a loop that you're able to legally repeat any number of times, you cannot say you're executing that loop infinity times because that's not an integer. You have to specify a number of times you're going to execute the loop, and in practice that number is just whatever arbitrary comically large number that the Dex pilot comes up with. 1,000,000 is a popular choice, but so is a Googleplex, or even Graham's number. Now, that brings us up to the next point that I wanted to address. In his video, Matt cites this rule here as evidence that maybe in the Parallel Lives scenario, a judge might rule that there would be 0 Parallel Lives tokens because it is not possible to determine the specific number that there are supposed to be. As someone with over a decade of experience judging Magic events, I can tell you that I could not imagine a judge ever ruling this way. The reason is that you can determine the specific number of tokens that will be created. Matt even published an expression for it in his video. It's true that writing a base 10 representation of this number is infeasible, but fortunately that's not what this rule is asking for. When this rule is talking about a number that can't be determined, it's talking about a different type of situation. Let's say you play this Phyrexian Jester and choose not to exile anything. Or maybe you exile an animated manland or something else that is not going to have a power into toughness in the exile zone. In that case, the game can't determine what the value of X and Y are, not because it isn't practically possible, because it is actually impossible. As far as I'm aware, there is not a specific rule or policy that's intended to cover the case where the game needs some information, but the players are unable to determine it, even though that task is in principle possible. The philosophy and case law behind related scenarios that are covered paints a pretty clear picture, though. For example, if you have an Omniscience out, you can repeatedly cast Petals of Insight, and, given that the size of your library is not congruent to 0, mod 3, you can end up with your cards in your library, stacked in whatever order you want, by manipulating what order that you put the cards back each time. Even so, the rules around loops and shortcuts stipulate that you can only shortcut a line of play if you can propose a specific end state and say exactly how many iterations that you will need to loop through in order to achieve it. Needless to say, no player was ever able to calculate exactly how many Petals of Insight casts it would take in order to get their library into the order they wanted. But judges weren't worried about that. In fact, there was an official ruling published that, in this case, the player did not need to be able to calculate the number of iterations needed, nor even articulate what they would need to do in order to calculate it. It was sufficient for the player to simply observe that such a play would be possible and demonstrate the principle. As another example, if you control a Zimone all-questioning and some sort of loop that you can perform any number of times that puts a land token into play on each iteration, it is possible, at least in principle, to make a Primo token with a greater power and toughness than any finite value. But since there's no easy way to tell whether any given large integer is a prime, it's unclear as to what the Zimone player would need to do in order to make this happen. Would they need to actually memorize a very large prime number and go through that many iterations of their loop? Or would it be sufficient to just know that one of a sufficient size existed? The majority of judges that I polled would accept the smallest prime number larger than a billion as being an unambiguous enough description of the number of iterations that they would allow it. And most even stuck by this ruling after I asked what would happen if the opponent had a chump blocker and the Zimone player had a way to give the Primo lifelink. In fact, the smallest prime number larger than a billion is a great choice if you're ever in this sort of scenario because a billion and 7 is actually a twin prime, meaning that if your opponent managed to kill Primo and disrupt your infinite lands combo, you could make another Primo by just playing 2 more lands. I talked about both of these scenarios in more detail in other videos that I've published, so you can check out the description if you're interested in a full breakdown. So what would a judge actually do if this sort of thing came up in an event? Well, the somewhat disappointing answer is that it probably doesn't matter because when one player has 33 Astral Dragons, that player is probably going to win. And that's before we even start talking about the number of Parallel Lives tokens that's so large nothing else in the game probably matters anyway. So yeah, that player would probably win the game, and if any situation came up where the specific number of tokens in play actually mattered for something, well, the judge would just have to do their best to figure out the most fair answer. This has more to do with problem-solving skills than rules and policy knowledge, though, so it's hard for me to say any more about what I would personally do without having more specifics about what was actually going on. It is true that the rules as written don't do a particularly good job covering this specific scenario, but that's okay because it's a corner case that's unlikely to come up in a serious event, and if that ever changes, then maybe the judges will come up with a more satisfying official policy, such as what happened in the Petals of Insight case. Unlike some other games, the rules of Magic don't have any protections in place to stop a player from putting the game in an undesirable state. As long as what you're trying to do is otherwise legal, that status won't change even if your play ends up making the game a draw, or even if it makes the game go into an unavoidable endless loop. In general, the consequences of a play that you're trying to make won't change whether it's legal to attempt to make that play. There's even a fun rules stunt that I covered where you can win the game by starting to do something you know you will not be able to legally complete. And speaking of that, I think a nice rules stunt would be a great way to close this one out. If you liked making an unreasonable number of Parallel Lives tokens, you're probably going to love the Mega Combo. This is an old puzzle among a certain group of dorks in the Magic community where the goal is to deal the most amount of damage possible on turn 1 of a Magic game without resorting to an infinite combo. Your library must be exactly 60 cards, but you can stack them in whatever order you want, and you can assume your opponent's library consists only of basic lands. If you're a fan of Magic lore, you already know that even if you restrict yourself to just cards from Magic's first set, the answer is already above 20, which is the starting life total. What do you think is possible to do with a modern card pool? Go ahead and make a guess. Well, whatever number you just said, I'm pretty confident it's smaller than the current record, which involves evaluating the Busy Beaver function with an argument that's already pretty big to start out with. The result makes the Parker number look about as big as 7. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.